I was recently reading an article which looked at the review of the government's Prevent program that was originally set up to combat Islamic terrorism, but of course that's not very PC, so they needed another scapegoat. So predictably enough, the gaze went down on the so-called far right, an issue that Keir Starmer thinks is one of the biggest Britain faces. Now, I've spoken on this channel before about how globalists and liberal types like to use the term far right to conjure up images of hate and genocide and people foaming at the mouth when they see someone with a different colour skin tone to them. They do this, of course, in an attempt to take ideological control over the conversation. That's why Prevent has ties to the egregious organisation Hope Not Hate. Henceforth, the whole thing has a huge leftist bias. This is why in the original report into the so-called far right, they earmarked anybody who was proud and patriotic. Jacob Rees-Mogg, the series Civilization, which is brilliant by the way, and Michael Portillo's railway journeys. Now, of course, they're demonising the majority of the country already when they do this, on the taxpayer too, by the way. But it makes more sense why they do this when you look at the books they're worried about. They state that Edmund Burke's conservative classic, Reflections on the Revolution in France, is of concern, as well as more predictably, 1984, Lord of the Rings by Tolkien and works by C.S. Lewis. Now again, this is absurd on the surface, I get it, but it makes a lot more sense when we look at the real structure of how modern politics really works. Our present rulers, the globalists and so on, they still want you to think in the traditional terms of left and right. They're the moderate people with love and care in their hearts, and the people that are against them are full of hate and anger. Yet this actually isn't how modern politics works at all. Sure, some people will hold views that are consistent with traditional far-right opinions, but the vast majority won't. Even some may have leftist views historically and would have voted for the Labour Party, but they see themselves turning more to a traditional mindset because of the globalist agenda. Henceforth, this isn't a battle between left and right, it's a battle between globalist utopians and the peoples in the heartlands of their countries who value the traditions of their cultures and their continents and their countries. This can be neatly summed up by a globalist liberal darling like Gary Lineker, who said recently that he was ashamed too while singing the national anthem. Now, many people have got quite upset about this, but why would you expect a globalist liberal like Gary Lineker to enjoy singing a national hymn towards God, King, or in his time Queen, and country? That's everything the globalist liberal project is against. This is typical from someone like Lineker, but you have to remember, he thinks that's moral to say something like that. It thinks it makes him seem conscious, worldly, caring, empathetic. This is because he's inculcated the core message of globalist liberalism. Western tradition is bad. Historical identity is extremely bad, and you must stand against it. This is also why they now demonize figures like Tolkien in his masterwork, Lord of the Rings. Why? Because he was in love with European mythology. He was a committed Catholic, and he was in search of a grounding story for England. Kenneth Clark, who presented the absolutely brilliant Civilization, which is on YouTube actually, I highly recommend it, Edmund Burke, Tolkien has already mentioned, and Lewis all fit into this mould. These figures are all part of the great chain of being known as tradition, which manifests in Great Britain. However, since Blair's vast cultural revolution, these people are now seen as obsolete, even potentially evil. These supposed heroes now are people who parrot the globalist, woke, neo-Marxist, neoliberal ideology, Gary Lineker and Nick Lowell's of Hope Not Hate, etc., etc. These denizens of our new moral order are essentially just the minions of Blairism. Blairism, of course, assumes that it's the centrist, moderate position, but we ignore every time we call it that Blair's changes that he made were huge and we're still suffering from the impacts of them. He was far from moderate. But of course, he's protected by the traditional view of the political spectrum. He'll just call anything he doesn't like far left or far right. He'll ignore the key question: what is true? Now, in Christian culture, we have a wonderful safety valve to this. You could say that Christ could be construed to have said things in modern terms that are consistent with far-left ideas or far-right ideas. But of course, it would be absurd to pigeonhole Christ into such simple political positions. He was way bigger than that. He was speaking to a much higher order of truth, that same order of truth that informed the foundations of Western culture. Yet the modern powers that be, the liberal agenda, don't want you to think this way. Again, they want you to think that they're the moderates and call anyone who doesn't agree with them far right, no matter if they voted Labour, Tory or Lib Dem all their life. Another technique they'll use as part of this is to imply that anyone who has a love for their homeland, their culture and tradition has some sort of critically unhealthy egoic attachment to their own prejudices. They see the notion of us having a spiritual desire to be part of the great chain of being that all humans seek to, whether that's the Gujarati Sikh, the Tibetan Buddhist or the English Christian, as bizarre as we haven't thrown off our deepest identities in favour of modernity and liberalism. And this leads to another technique of attack, that anybody who thinks this way is some ideologue trapped believing their own political views are eternal and always right. And in a sense, they're right about that. You do get some people that are trapped on the right or the hard right or the far right who do hold to political ideologies as if they're the answer to everything, when of course they're not. All ideologies are human, meaning they're fallen and won't work for every period of time. Tradition, however, is something much deeper, as it's rooted in the Transcendent. And this is what they don't understand. There is something deeper than ideologies. And second to that, they don't recognise that they're trapped in their own ideology most of the time as well. The same with the leftists, the far leftists, the globalists and the liberals. Yet it's the adherence to tradition which provides the shared moral structure, the shared mythology to allow the movement between different political positions to aid the country in which way it needs to go at a certain time in history. And I know it's strong language, but this is why we're in a spiritual battle fundamentally. It's not left and right, it's globalism versus tradition. The globalists, of course, inhabit this perfect utopian, technologically advanced and sanitized world, although it has a deep shadow side which more and more people are seeing. The tradition on one side can seem stuffy to us because it's been so consistent in our lives, but people are starting to wake up again to its vibrancy, to its centrality in our moral and personal, spiritual and social lives. We're seeing that without adherence to the great ancient tradition that got us where we are, ideologues are pulling out the blocks and the foundations of our culture, and the West is shaking. Worse still, we're ruled by people who don't have any appreciation for any of this, and they're increasingly using the arm of the state to crack down on anybody who has traditionalist leanings. This, in my mind, is because they don't understand what tradition is, they don't understand what the far right is, they don't understand what the human being is fundamentally. That's always been my criticism of liberal rationalist humanism. Yet there is a silver lining here with all of this. The more that the regime hacks away at our ancient traditions, the more the foundations of them are revealed, and they shine all the more to people who've realised they've lost something vital and can get it back if they wake up their ancient practice. And as I'm sure you're already aware, none of this is about hating anybody or anything. In fact, it's about love, and it's a recognition of who and what you are in the deepest context. These are just my views, however. Do let me know what you think down below, and do consider subscribing to the channel.